Now let's get into snare drum kind of mixing and processing on the bus in this case, because we've got all these layers and now we want to adjust them further, and we also kind of want to glue them together by adding some compression, some saturation to create some intermodulation, kind of like you would glue a whole mix together, but just gluing snare layers together to make them sound a bit more natural and unified, I suppose. So I want to start this off with EQ and kind of with a little complaint about a lot of YouTube videos that teach you about snare EQ, because sometimes they will say things like on snares always boost 3K, always cut lows, always do this or that, and I think that's really not how this goes. The only thing that can really tell you what you need to cut or boost is the snare itself. So you listen to it in the context of your mix, and you have this kind of awareness of the different frequency areas of the snare and what they add, um, or what they sound like. So I talked about this in the anatomy of a snare drum, and that's kind of why I did this, because if you can listen to a snare and say, okay, this has too much brightness, you EQ it accordingly. If you say this doesn't have enough snap, has too much fundamental, doesn't have enough fundamental, that kind of stuff, you just can go by ear. So I've actually turned my frequency analyzer of my EQ Plus preset off, just so I don't get distracted by how this looks and really just listen to the sound. And then I can kind of try to find these different frequencies. So when I hear this, the first thing I kind of hear that in the highs there's something that's kind of flat, and I think it's caused by this test tone here. No, it isn't. It might be this blur, and it might be a bit of this test tone here. I'm not quite sure, so I'm gonna actually fix this with EQ on the bus. There's this kind of flat, noisy sound that I don't really like, so I want to turn this down with EQ, and I know that I'll need to look in this kind of frequency area here, so this kind of sandy. There's a bit of it here, and then there's a lot of kind of sandiness, I would describe it as here, so I want to turn this down a bit. Then maybe I want a bit more brightness and a bit more sharpness. You can hear these kind of resonances that sit around this area, so I'm gonna boost this with a sort of narrow Q. If you use a narrow Q, so like something like this, you can hear this kind of ringing it has, while with a wider Q it sounds a bit more natural. It's not really ringing, it's a kind of, it sounds like, to me, it sounds like the sound is heard through a tube or something, and the tube has like a resonance, so you can, I exaggerate this, you know, this kind of sound. While if I make this a bit wider, I don't really get that effect as much. Then we know we've got our fundamental around 200 Hertz, so we might want to cut our lows, we might not. Sometimes it's nice to keep them in. You just use like a steep 6-pole maybe. So this kind of thing. Then let's maybe listen again. Don't really like this 1K stuff, to be honest. And you can hear this has quite a different effect to layering, because we're just making stuff louder or quieter, we're not adding information. You can hear how this really boosts the fundamental. And ideally you're doing this in the context of a mix, of course, so maybe quite like this resonance here. I actually want to do this with quite a narrow Q, so this is the kind of shape I ended up at. We could have done this with a lot simpler moves, but I kind of like to put these different bands together sometimes. You could of course also just like add one band and pull this up, but this way we really kind of get to sculpt it with these different slopes and so on. So let's listen to it with EQ and without. Just sounds a bit nicer. And this is something, once again, that just takes a bit of practice and ear training. There's one thing I kind of want to turn down a bit more. Just take this band, turn it into another bell. I'm trying to find this. If you hold these upper arrows here, you can kind of solo this like a bandpass. Maybe try to find what exactly is bothering me here. It's this kind of stuff here. I don't really like this. So let's maybe turn this down a bit. And just turn the band on and off, see if it actually makes the sound better. Now next let's move to compression and transient shaping, which are really kind of the same thing. So I'm gonna get a compressor. We're gonna get the new Compressor Plus because it's nice and fancy. And the two modes I mostly like for snares are glue, which is really good because it has a long attack that really is good at preserving the transient. And then smash, which is almost a kind of distortion if you use it right. So I'm gonna get a scope here, just to really show you what this does to the sound. And we're gonna make this a bit wider. So you can see how we've got this kind of, this envelope here. And if we, for example, take this compressor, maybe turn auto timing down, and keep the release low and the attack high, we can kind of compress the snare, but keep the first part through. So we can move the threshold down, turn the knee down, here in glue mode, and then just, you can see how it really lets this first thing spike through and really gives up as a sharp transient. Maybe made the attack a bit longer. Kind of want to, if I turn this off, you can see how it's kind of got this secondary peak here, and I don't really like that. Let's make this mid on this side. So if I turn this compressor on, I can kind of mitigate those. And then I will dial back the threshold a bit, just to not overdo this, dial back the ratio a bit. Maybe give it some release. And you can hear how we can kind of use this compressor like a transient shaper. Maybe loudness match, Alt L. Doesn't really make a difference. And then maybe get the threshold up a bit. Actually, no, I'll keep this down, and then later we can clip this peak off a bit. So we can kind of use this for transient shaping. Then we can also use a transient shaper. Bitwig has its own transient shaper. Excuse me. Called transient control, which kind of lets you turn up the attack. This is of course way too loud, so let's put a limiter on this. And maybe get a tool to just move this down a bit. Then we can really turn up the attack here with this, or really turn up the sustain with this. But I don't really like how this sounds, so I prefer this plugin called Kilohertz Transient Shaper, which is a free plugin. So I would recommend that you get it, because it's really nice, in my opinion. And you can just use this to kind of shape the transients, and I actually prefer to use compressor to kind of get the first transient up. And then I mostly use transient shapers almost like a gate. So I turn the sustain all the way down. And you can see, if I turn the speed up, how it mostly kind of cuts off the tail and shortens the overall sound. And then I can kind of dial the speed back to control how long the sound can be. And this can further help kind of glue the sound together. So let's maybe get this all in a chain here. And just listen to the difference we've made so far. Gonna move these all inside. Do some loudness matching here. And take a look at this. You can see how the envelope really changed with the compression applied to it. And then also how the EQ kind of changed the envelope a little bit, because this is mostly high frequency stuff that we kind of turned down. So yeah, this is a bit of a nicer snare drum in my opinion. Now I want a bit more EQ. Kind of boosting the highs, just because it sounded a bit dull to my ears. It's a very subtle difference, but it can matter in my opinion. Then let's think what we can add next. So if we want to optimize this for loudness. Oh no, I want to show you something with a spectral suit first. So you can use this this transient split here, of course. And this can add some pre-ringing to your transient. So maybe we can actually visualize this. No, we can't. Let us zoom in a bit. And turn the threshold down by like a lot. Zoom in a bit further. Let's maybe see if we can see the difference. No, it doesn't really matter. So you can hear the transients here. And we will set this to percussive mode. Really the short kind of, this kind of snappy part. And then the tones part. And then we can, for example, EQ these differently. But be aware that this can cause some artifacts here. So I hear in this tones part some stuff in the lower mids that I don't really like. Just the fundamental is a bit much for me, so maybe just turn this down a tiny bit. Then maybe listen to the transient part. Maybe I want to boost the brightness a little bit on the transient. So let's just get an EQ2 with a high shelf. Actually maybe a bell. This is kind of like the split EQ plugin, but just done with Bitwig stuff. And then if we just turn this off and on, kind of cleaned it up a bit, brightened it up a bit, maybe brightened it up a bit too much. And yeah, this is our snare drum. Now, one last thing is kind of optimizing this for loudness. And the way you would do this is by using a clipper. So there is Bitwig's native over, and there's also a free plugin I prefer to over, which is K-Clip, which is just a really good clipping algorithm. For reasons I don't want to get into this in this course, but there's a great YouTube lesson on it by Buffermetrics, where it essentially goes into clipping and oversampling and the way oversampling can cause peaking above 0 dB and how kind of different clippers deal with that and stuff, but that's too much for this course, so I'm just gonna refer you to that and just compare these two. So let's maybe get NFX selector, and this comes with Bitwig. This is free, so yeah, I would recommend you get this K-Clip 0 because it's a really good clipper. And we can kind of see that we can use this clipper, just turn down its threshold to kind of cut off these high peaks. And we don't really hear much of a difference, and that's kind of where the elegance of clipping lies. That gives us extra headroom, so now we can turn this sound up a lot louder without hitting 0 dB. Because we've removed this first initial high transient part and kind of turned the peak energy into harmonic energy with this clipper that has kind of saturated. We can add a bit of a knee here. Sometimes that sounds better. We can kind of use this multiband control here. Just go by ear and kind of maybe clip this as at -4 dB. And you can see how we've gained a lot of headroom this way. We can now make our snare a lot louder while peaking at a much lower value. Now let's compare this to K-Clip. So this is the plugin clipper. And let me just see. So we can open this and you can see it's this kind of clipper UI. And let's just also clip this by -4 dB. We link these because we've set this threshold to -4. So we want to make sure we turn our output down if we turn our input up by 4 dB. And we can also soften this. And just like with Over, we've kind of gained headroom. Different clippers kind of have slightly different sounds here. Kind of up to you which you prefer. K-Clip is a bit cleaner, Over has a bit more character to my ear, but the difference is very subtle. So maybe don't overthink this. And then another thing we can do is just to add a bit of saturation to our sound. So we can just we also just do this with Over, or we can use like a distortion or something. And just drive this a bit. And we can really squash this into like this kind of sausage shape, which I personally am not a big fan of. It just doesn't sound as nice. So maybe don't drive this too hard. Maybe EQ this a bit before the saturation. Yeah, I don't really like this distortion right now. So let's just go through all the steps again. This is kind of my mixing processing for this particular snare drum. So we've added some EQ first. Just kind of removing some mud in the, not mud, just stuff in the lows that we don't really hear anyway. That's not essential to the snare. And then just shaping the frequency profile a bit, kind of going by these different areas that I talked about in the snare anatomy video and just going, what do we want more, what do we want less? Really just listening for the sound. Don't just do general moves. Just understand these frequency areas and make your own decisions. So if you listen to this, we've just added this kind of more snap around this 1K area here. And that's basically it. Then we've compressed the sound to kind of exaggerate the transient here a bit. And then later drive it into the clipper. So you can hear this is quite subtle. We can actually do this a bit more if you want. To really get the kind of transient to stand out, but I don't really want that. And another reason I like to use this glue is just to kind of maybe add some knee and kind of glue the different layers together. So this is gonna be really, really subtle in this case. In some cases I work a lot less subtle. Really subtle difference, just kind of building up our chain. Kind of shaping the envelope of the snare a bit, making these different layers kind of work together. This just turns the volume down, if I remember correctly. No, it actually does nothing. So let's remove that. Then we get the transient shaper. Kind of clean up our tail a bit, shorten it a bit, make it a bit snappier. I personally just really like snappy snares. We get another EQ, just boosting the highs a tiny, tiny bit. Then we get our transient split here, EQing transients and body differently. This really boosts the transient, as you can see here. So we've got the transient here, which we've applied a bit just by ear, a bit of high frequency boost to. Just to make it cut through a bit more, give it a bit more snap, a bit more presence. And then in the tones I removed a bit of fundamental here because it felt a bit too boomy, a bit too, I don't know, you can hear this kind of tone around the fundamental. I used to have more difficult hearing this, so if I ever say you can hear this and you can't hear this, that doesn't mean that you have some kind of disability, it just means you need practice. I used to really worry about this, but the more you do this, you just learn to hear this kind of stuff. You can hear, hopefully you can hear how we've kind of taken out a bit of this fundamental area of this stuff here. And then, yeah, we've used this transient split to kind of do some split EQ stuff. And then we've clipped this. In this case, we've gone for over. Sometimes I prefer to go for a K clip. Just nice to have different clipping options, just to gain us some headroom here. And add some grit to the sound, so you can see how it just chops off this first peak here. And just really helps out get the sound loud, because now if we add makeup gain, which I wouldn't recommend while you're clipping because you'll fall for loudness bias, we can hear that while keeping the same peak value, we can now make the sound 4 dB louder. So that's really what clipping has achieved. It hasn't achieved us go from this to this, but it has achieved us to be able to go from this to this, which is just, we can make the snare a lot louder. So that's really what this clipping has gained us. But yeah, we want to keep makeup off so we can kind of judge that it doesn't add too many artifacts without being distracted by the loudness, even though the loudness is our final goal. So yeah, that was processing the snare drum. I hope I didn't bore you with too much yapping here. Let me see how long this turned out. Another 20 minutes, so yeah, that should be fine. I hope I really managed to hammer in that what really matters is just that you know what these effects do, you know how they work, and then you can just go by ear and kind of, what do you want to hear more of, what do you want to hear less of, maybe go readjust the layering a bit. And with this clipping, it's really useful to just be able to see this oscilloscope, so you can just see how loud is your sound peaking. Can you maybe gain some more headroom by just clipping this down? And that's our snare drum for now. So yeah, see you on the next section on hi-hats. Bye.